All right, so everyone's talking about how challenging the upcoming couple of years are going to be from a budget perspective. And that means you need to take control of how dollars flow out of your organization. So, how do you do that? Well, it starts with the data, and specifically data on how, where, when, and with what frequency purchases are being made all across your various departments. You may or may not have a procure to pay platform that makes it easy to measure this type of activity. But to get you inspired, you should go check out Procurify's brand new Charter School Benchmark Report. It just came out a couple weeks ago and offers 10 procurement benchmarks from charter schools across the country, highlighting things like average PO volumes, spend per vendor, items per vendor, how long it takes to go from requisition to PO, and so on. Not only will you be intrigued to answer these same questions for your school, it might also shine a light on opportunities for cost control next year. You can go to procurify.com/resources to download a copy or check out the episode description, and we've linked to it there as well. All right, now back to the show.
Welcome to Charter School Insider, lessons from the nation's top charter school operators, the only podcast dedicated to the behind-the-scenes business of running a successful charter school. Join us as we sit down with charter school leaders who share how they are overcoming the biggest operational hurdles facing their schools today.
All right, so I just got back from a few days in Boston, Massachusetts at the National Charter Schools Conference. This year it was up in Boston, and it was a fantastic event. So shout out to the Public Alliance for National Charter Schools. Really just an awesome opportunity to spend a few days networking with other leaders in the community, hearing from really fascinating speakers, and talking to different school leaders about kind of the current trends and plans for the upcoming year. And during the conference, I did a mini talk on procurement best practices. And so, what I thought I'd do for those who didn't make it to Boston and didn't make it to the procurement session, I thought I'd put together a little mini class in the form of a podcast episode. So, that's what this episode is. It's a new format. We haven't really done this. And so, if you like it, I'd love to hear from you. Shoot us a note at podcast@byq.org. Before I dive in, we have some phenomenal guests upcoming. So hopefully you're sticking with us. And we have guests from all across the country coming on over the summer to talk on all sorts of topics, everything from building an operations leadership pipeline to thinking about taking over underperforming schools and growing a network that way, to thinking about leadership development, all sorts of interesting topics. So really excited for some of the guests that are coming on. And if you would like to come on the show or you know someone who'd be a great guest, please drop us a note. So without further ado, here's 5 best practices to turn procurement into a pillar of financial stability. So before we dive in, why to the best practices, that is, why procurement? Why does this even matter? So if you don't follow the Economics Lab at Georgetown University, highly recommend giving them a follow. They put out all sorts of interesting research and data on public trends in education finance. I attended a webinar they did recently, and one of the slides they had, and I'll link to this in the show notes, showed the year over year, and this is not just for charter schools, by the way, this is all of K-12, the year-over-year net effect on typical budget trends as it relates to essentially the current environment we're in. So ESSER sunsetting, macro inflation, et cetera, et cetera. You all know this, but they called this upcoming academic year, 24-25, I'm going to use their words. I thought this was a little morbid, but they called it the year of the bloodletting. So basically, the 24-25 year is going to be the most impacted. They're showing around a -6, -7% overall net effect on budget trends down. And then they show that coming back up to around -3, -4% in 25-26. But what this means is this is going to be a squeeze year in terms of funds available on the whole. Obviously, depending on where you are in the country, that may not be the case. Maybe your enrollment's way up. Maybe you were very strategic in the use of your ESSER funds. But this is why something like procurement matters. There's a whole variety of levers that you can pull when it comes to cost control. And you should look at those giant buckets like the debt on your facility or things like staff, salaries, and benefits, those kind of top 2 to 3 categories in your P&L. But procurement can make a big difference, and it's often overlooked. It's sort of that broad category of how all the other dollars flow into these kind of OpEx categories. Really, how your organization is spending money day in and day out across a whole bunch of departments, across a whole bunch of staff who are making those decisions. So at BuyQ, we work with thousands of schools on procurement. And so we've seen just about every iteration of procurement at various sized charter schools, some of the largest and some of the smallest single site schools. And we often boil it down to sort of four core pillars of procurement excellence. So, four core pillars, and just about every procurement problem falls into one of these buckets, or there's an opportunity for improvement in one of these buckets. So, I wanted to start here and kind of lay this out, and then we'll get into 5 example best practices if you want to start to take a look at your procurement process at your school. So, first, the 4 pillars. Pillar number 1, strategic sourcing and cost management. Basically ensuring that your organization is utilizing its buying power to secure value and maintain a cost through a strategic approach. So strategic sourcing has to do with where you're getting goods from, and then cost management, day-to-day management of those costs in terms of, things like inventory and matching need to the cycles of placing orders, et cetera, et cetera. So that's pillar number 1, strategic sourcing and cost management. Pillar number 2, policies, compliance, and risk management. Basically, you want to safeguard against risk. You want to adhere to your own organization's ethical and policy standards, as well as your state's. There's all sorts of headaches that can come in this pillar. Pillar number 3, technology and data. So this is how you're actually utilizing tools and resources to streamline your procurement process, to track your procurement process, to identify opportunities or inefficiencies in procurement process. So that's why we have this as a core pillar, technology and data. Fourth, and definitely not least important, is stakeholder engagement and communication. You can have the best procurement plan in the world. If nobody knows about it and nobody follows it, then you're going to have all sorts of challenges. And so that's why stakeholder engagement, stakeholder meaning everyone from someone who says, hey, I need this thing for my classroom, maybe a teacher, on up to the CFO that's kind of looking at the big financial picture. Everyone needs to be engaged in your procurement strategy, and they need to know proactively the goals the organization has. So that's pillar number 4, stakeholder engagement and communication. Now, obviously, there's all sorts of subcategories within those 4 pillars that you could focus on. You could look at your staffing model. You could look at, individual tools that you're using to manage procurement. You could look at vendor contracts or real-time reporting. There's all sorts of subcategories, but they generally fall into one of those 4 core pillars of procurement excellence. So that can feel like a lot. So what I have to talk through today is just 5 kind of simple best practices to take a more proactive approach to procurement instead of a reactive approach. Most of the time, we're reactive in the way that procurement happens at our school. A need arises, we say, oh, we need something and we need it fast. And then we go find the cheapest cost we can find or the place we can get it the fastest, and we fill that need. And that micro process happens over and over and over again. And there's not a systematic approach to strategic procurement. So here's 5 things you can do today to go from reactive to proactive. Number 1, revisit your purchasing policy. So this kind of seems like a silly one because a purchasing policy is just a piece of paper. How can this really change my organization? Well, as you recall, pillar number 4 on our 4 pillars of excellence was stakeholder engagement and communication. And a purchasing policy should be a source of truth for how something actually is procured in your organization. And it should be a living, breathing document. It shouldn't be something someone created 10 years ago and hasn't changed and nobody really knows what's in it. It's designed to help you actually reduce the total cost of goods and services. That's not just the list price of a product you buy, but the total cost of goods and services. And that includes indirect spend, such as staff time actually purchasing. And it's also supposed to create institutional knowledge. So it answers those questions your staff have about, who, what, where, when, how do we actually get the things we need? And in reality, a lot of times what happens is a purchasing policy gets created and then your staff treat it like the Pirates of the Caribbean Pirates Code. It's more like guidelines than actual rules, and nobody really follows it or actually knows what's in the policy. So step number 1 is to revisit your purchasing policy. And the tactical tip for you would be work backwards from an end state that you don't have today, but that you would like to have. So, for example, maybe one of the things you're trying to mitigate on is sort of rogue spending. Maybe teachers putting costs on their credit card, or your operations staff sort of spending with vendors that have not been approved. Work backwards from, we don't want that to happen. So what do we need to put in our purchasing process to make sure that that doesn't happen? But also, how do we remove approval bottlenecks and ambiguity so that we're actually enabling our staff to make decisions? It helps them do their job easier, but also mitigates the unwanted action that's occurring. And this is an iterative process, as I mentioned. Your purchasing policy should not be a one and done. It should be something that's looked at annually. Practice number 2, listen to your data story. So this is a hard one, because oftentimes the real challenge here is that nobody is paying attention to the data. And here's what I mean. At your school, let me ask a rhetorical question here. At your school, does finance own procurement, or does operations own procurement? So you can reflect on that question. A lot of times the answer is both. And sometimes the answer is, my operations team thinks my finance team owns it, and vice versa. What ends up happening is, very rarely is there a dedicated kind of procurement team, unless you're a really large CMO. You've got maybe 20, 30, 40 schools, and you have the resources to have that team. A lot of times you don't have that dedicated person. And so what happens is, nobody is actually looking at the procurement data story. And what do I mean by that? So procurement data does not mean budget versus actuals. That's kind of the go-to sort of monthly meeting with your finance team, where you say, hey, are we over budget? Are we under budget? How are we pacing? That's really important. There's nothing wrong with that. But a BVA meeting only tells you kind of a macro data point. Are we over or under? And what are the implications of that? What you really want to do is start to lift up the rock of the kind of spent dollars and start to look underneath and look at the things that are happening to get you to that point. That's where you start to learn a lot. How many different vendors did we spend with? How frequently? What is the process for a PO to get generated, and how long does that take? How many different layers of approval happen before a purchase can go through? Where are we buying everything? Are we buying, the same categories from 5 different places? That's the data that starts to get really interesting. And that's the data that starts to provide you opportunities for cost savings. So here's the tactical tip on this one. If you want to start to collect some very easy, kind of low-hanging fruit procurement data, I would recommend starting with your top 5 suppliers. So go ask your finance team. If you're not on the finance team, who do we spend the most money with? Pick our top 5 vendors and go to your account manager. If you don't know who that is, I'm sure somebody does, or you can email them. Someone will get back to you eventually, or just say you're canceling your account, and then they'll definitely get back to you. Sorry, suppliers, that was mean. Have them on a quarterly basis, or maybe even a monthly basis, send you a breakdown of your spend. And you can have them take a look at what they send you first, and then have them add additional fields of data if it's not what you want to see. So they have all this data because they are analyzing how you're spending with them. But if you don't request them to share that data back with you, they might not, because it's not necessarily their job per se. But they have that data, and they can send you a file that has kind of a breakdown of your spend, and they can probably even provide some analysis for you to say, hey, by the way, you have 3 schools. Here's how the spending looks. One of your schools buys all these different things from us, and your other 2 schools only buy X from us. And if you do that with your top 5 suppliers, you're going to start to get some really interesting data back, just in terms of what's actually being purchased across your organization. And that can start to build an early data set for making some tweaks and changes along the way. All right. Practice number 3, develop a collaborative and accountable supplier relationship. So if we stick with our previous example of your top 5 suppliers, a good question to ask yourself is, what's that relationship look like? Are we friends? Are we enemies? Are we frenemies? What type of value do they drive for our organization? Are we constantly, battling them on issues we're facing or price? What you want in your supplier relationships is some level of mutual accountability. And it really all starts with understanding the incentives. So if you think about the incentives on both sides, their goal is to retain and grow your business. They're a for profit organization. They want to retain you as a customer and they want to sell you more goods or services. Your goal is to source quality goods and services at an affordable price. It doesn't need to be the best price, but you want a fair price. And it's hard to develop an accountable relationship without setting clear expectations or setting shared goals. If you treat them like order takers, they are going to be order takers. But if you treat your key supplier partnerships as strategic relationships that drive value for the organization, then you start to get into that collaborative and accountable business relationship. And the tactical tip here is focus on some basic questions that shift the relationship to being more strategic. And actually, we talked a little bit about this in one of our previous episodes. I believe it was episode 7 with Anders, where he talked a little bit about this. But some questions you can ask your suppliers are, what are the most important metrics for success? If we could only track X number of things, 2 things, 3 things. Ask them that question. What should we be tracking and why? What does excellence look like and why? And maybe who is another charter school that's a good example of this so that you can go call them and say, hey, what can we learn from you? Another question would be explain to us our pricing. What's it based on? What impacts it? Are there opportunities for cost reduction? That's a goal for us this year. What would need to be true for us to bring down the price of X 10%, 20%, et cetera? Asking some of these basic questions will really change the nature of the relationship and make them more likely as a key supplier to drive more value for you long term. All right, practice number 4. Standardize and consolidate when applicable to drive value. So a lot of times organizations think that they're doing this. They say, oh, we have a list of preferred vendors and we consolidate our spend with those vendors, which helps us drive the best price. And oftentimes that is true. But what can happen over the years is that list of preferred vendors gets really long and no one's ever taken off it unless there's something, catastrophic or illegal or the company shuts down. When in reality, you want to have kind of an ongoing process of evaluating your suppliers and standardizing and consolidating across your organization to provide consistency and also set expectations for staff. Consolidating doesn't mean you buy everything from one vendor. It just means where there's redundancy and you can save time for your finance team, your AP team, and you can save effort as it relates to, optimizing the invoice workflow or reconciliations or you name it. You want to take advantage of that. So I always use the example of paper because it's kind of a silly example. It's a micro example, but paper's really expensive and the price can fluctuate and people end up buying it from all over the place. So maybe your organization is in this case where you bought paper from 10 different places last year because at a moment in time, you kept finding a better price. When in reality, there was probably an opportunity to just consolidate all of that paper spend with a single supplier, get the best cost that they could offer you based on that total volume and save your team a ton of time, energy, and effort. And then, your staff who are using that paper are used to the same exact product time and time again, and they're not frustrated that the new paper doesn't fit with the old copier, et cetera, et cetera. So the tactical tip here would be utilize your spend reports that you're going to get from your top 5 suppliers, see practice 2 that we already talked about, and review categories across those top 5 suppliers for the same products and services from multiple different vendors. So you can identify, hey, here's some categories that we're buying all over the place from a bunch of different providers. Most likely you're doing that because of price or because you have multiple campuses and you have a decentralized procurement process where, your local campus leader and their ops team have, their autonomy to buy from wherever. And what ends up happening is you kind of have redundant suppliers across a whole host of categories. So use the spend reports that your key suppliers are sending back to you and look for trends and some opportunities to consolidate and drive total value. And if you don't have the time to do this, reach out to us here at BuyQ. We do this all the time for schools, and we're happy to advocate on your behalf and hopefully provide cost savings. Now to number 5, last best practice here: measure performance and iterate. The old adage is what gets measured gets managed. If it's not being measured, it's probably not being managed. And so as you think about your overall procurement process, if you're not collecting any data whatsoever, let's start with the easy things. So this could be, some really basic KPIs around staff satisfaction with goods and services. It could be around reasonable cost. It could be around, frequency of repair or replacement cycle. And so the tactical tips here would be, first and foremost, break the mental model of price being the core driver for decisions and for performance. Because at the end of the day, you can shop until you're blue in the face and always find a slightly better price. And as you do that, eventually you're going to start to degrade the value of the product or service. If you constantly keep trying to find the cheaper option, and shopping takes a lot of time. So, tactical tip number 1 on this is break price as kind of one of your core KPIs. Obviously, it's important to track, and it's part of this overall discussion that we're having about cost reduction, but it shouldn't be the primary metric, because if price is what you measure, that's what gets managed. So it means your team is gonna be incentivized to, trade quality for price. The second tip would be utilize basic tools to gather data in areas where you're just not getting any feedback today. So this could literally be a quarterly 3-question staff survey, and each quarter you pick a different category of goods and services and just ask for feedback on, it could be anything. Are the technology devices we're using, are they satisfactory or are they very unsatisfactory? From a scale of 1 to 10, how quality do you think the goods are? And then ask for open feedback or something like that. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can be really, really basic. And that provides you data so that the next time you go have a conversation with your supplier, it's not just you and your account manager. You have a corpus of data that you've built around what you're trying to accomplish for your organization and how that supplier is or isn't supporting that overall goal. So, to recap, 5 best practices to start to shift procurement from reactive to proactive. Number 1, revisit your purchasing policy regularly and iteratively. Number 2, find and listen to your data story. So don't just rely on budget versus actuals as your procurement data. Go pick up the rocks and look underneath. Number 3, build accountable, collaborative supplier relationships. Develop KPIs together, develop goals together. Number 4, standardize and consolidate where appropriate. And number 5, track performance and iterate. If you don't measure anything, it's really hard to manage those things. So, those are just 5 examples of practices that you could begin today to start to get a handle on procurement for your organization, start to shift to a more strategic approach to procuring goods and services. If you found this interesting, I'd love to talk to you. Our team would love to talk to you a little bit more about what we do here at BuyQ. We offer group purchasing contracts, and we also offer procurement consulting. So this is the world that we live in, and hopefully you found this interesting. In the show notes, I'll link to the presentation slides that go along with this talk if you find the visuals helpful. So thanks for listening, and look out for our next episode, which will be an interview with an operations leader. So you can look forward to that. All right, that's it. We'll see you at the next one.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@byq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.